participating remotely, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute a participant's microphone when the participant is not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. If you're participating remotely and are experiencing connectivity issues, please contact staff immediately so those issues can be resolved. Members participating in the hearing room or on the remote platform are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request permission. If you are participating remotely and I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other circumstances. Members must have their cameras on and be visible on screen in order to be recognized. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. If you are on the remote platform and choose to participate in a different proceeding, please turn your camera off. Finally, we've established an email box for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to your staff. I now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, once again, and welcome to the Budget Committee's Members' Day hearing. This day is a long-standing tradition for the Budget Committee, and each year I look forward to this opportunity to hear from our colleagues on their budget priorities. Our last Members' Day hearing was in March of 2021, and the world looked undeniably different then. In the years since, we have made tremendous progress in our fight against COVID and in our economic recovery. We've gone from approximately 53 million Americans fully vaccinated to more than 220 million Americans fully vaccinated. A record number of jobs were created in the U.S. last year, with 8.3 million created since President Biden took office. The number of people relying on unemployment benefits has dropped from 18 million to approximately 1 million. The lowest level since 1970. And just last year, Americans started 5.4 million new businesses, more than any other year on record. This progress was neither predicted nor guaranteed. It was largely the result of the investments in the American Rescue Plan, and it's the main reason our economic recovery is far outpacing most of our global competitors. But Congress's work is not done. American families and our economy still face interconnected challenges that threaten to destabilize households and slow our record-breaking recovery. Vladimir Putin's unprovoked war in Ukraine, a persistent mismatch between supply and demand, and pandemic-related supply chain issues have put upward pressure on prices, not just in the U.S., but around the world. The U.S. is among the many advanced economies that are experiencing inflation above 5% right now. This includes countries that did not enact major recovery legislation like the American Rescue Plan. So we have a global multinational problem, and our Republican colleagues are insisting it has a uniquely American cause. Why? I think we all know why, and it's certainly not helpful to the American people, but I'll move on. The Federal Reserve is best positioned to tackle immediate inflation concerns, but Congress can and must do everything it can to lower costs for American families overall. Smart and necessary investments in early education and child care, health care, and affordable housing would be enormously helpful to families while expanding opportunities for parents and children. Common sense reforms to rebalance our tax code to reward work, not wealth, will cut taxes for families and ensure that huge corporations are paying their fair share. In the short term, these investments will improve the lives of American families and strengthen our recovery. In the long term, they will foster increased opportunities and a more equitable and productive economy. That is what the American people want from their government, and that is what the American people need from their government. I'm sure my colleagues on the other side of the dais will have lots to say about inflation today. I, for one, would welcome an explanation on how the American Rescue Plan also managed to cause high inflation in France, the UK, Brazil, and so many other countries around the world. I'd also like to know why on earth they think raising taxes on half of Americans, from teachers to firefighters, is a solution to high inflation. That's the only Republican leadership plan I've seen put forward, and it would be devastating to American families. But the true purpose of this hearing is to get as much helpful input as possible. We are here to listen to our colleagues and learn about the concerns of their constituents. It's my hope that today's hearing will provide insight into the issues and longer-term budgetary challenges this committee should examine as we work to build an economy that works for all Americans. Once again, I want to thank members for taking time out of their busy schedules to appear before our committee today, and I look forward to their testimony. With that, I would like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth. It's fair to say the country is in a different place since our last Members' Day, and not a good place. Inflation has risen 11% since President Biden took office, and it continues to run at a 40-year high. Gas hit its highest price ever this week, and over 2.4 million illegal immigrants have been apprehended at the southern border. And now families are facing a national shortage of baby formula. The president's signature piece of legislation, the so-called American Rescue Plan, was jammed through this committee before we even had a chance to organize. It added $2 trillion to the deficit and sparked an inflationary fire that has driven a massive rise in prices to all Americans. Then a few months later, you were at it again, pushing through the president's $5 trillion Build Back Broke agenda, the most expensive bill in American history. But since this is our annual Members' Day hearing, I'd like to mention the things that members on our side wish this committee would focus and spend its time on. Number one, can we actually debate a budget this year? It's been over 1,400 days, Mr. Chairman, 1,400 days since we marked up a budget resolution in this committee. Are we going to keep spending without a plan? Will Democrats once again forfeit their responsibility and smuggle top-line spending numbers into another bill so they don't have to debate them? Number two, can we fulfill our obligation under committee and House rules to actually hold some oversight hearings? It is beyond time for this committee to examine the trail of waste and abuse left behind by the American Rescue Plan. $783 million for checks to prisoners, $40 million for libraries in the president's home state of Delaware, $2 million for trees to be planted in New York, and the list goes on and on. If we're not doing a budget this year, then perhaps we can use that time to have an oversight hearing on that spending. An idea, Mr. Chairman, that one of your Democrat colleagues on this committee agreed was needed at a recent hearing. Number three, when are we going to talk about the impact mounting debt is having on our budget and American families? The Federal Reserve is raising interest rates to deal with the president's inflation crisis. Higher rates will make it even harder for families to buy a house, small businesses to expand, and farmers to buy equipment. But it will also impact our government's bottom line. Earlier this month, I released a report that shows the destructive effects higher interest rates would have on the federal budget. For example, if rates return to their 50-year average, the federal government will be paying $1.3 trillion in interest on our national debt today. If they rise to the levels we saw the last time inflation was this high, today's interest payments would be $2.6 trillion. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert the report into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Number four, how about getting to the bottom of the causes and consequences of inflation? President Biden's strategy of blaming inflation on a new villain every month is failing. First, he denied inflation existed. Then he called it temporary, and now it's Putin's fault. The truth is that inflation rose 7.5% before Putin's army stepped foot in Ukraine. The real culprit that helped spark inflation, according to economists, was the American Rescue Plan. And number five, this committee should examine the billions President Biden is spending through executive orders. The endless student loan moratorium cost $4.3 billion every month. $6 million is being paid every day to DOD contractors to babysit $350 million in unused border wall materials. Taxpayers who are struggling to pay for basic necessities should not be on the hook for these costly executive actions. These are things this committee should be focused on. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the ranking member for his opening remarks. Members appearing before the committee today will have 5 minutes to give 5 minutes to give their oral testimony, and their written statements will be made part of the formal record. I ask unanimous consent that members have until the end of the day to submit any written materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. In addition, members of the committee will be permitted to question witnesses following their statements. But out of consideration of our colleagues' time, I would ask that you please keep your comments brief. We will have two panels today. I'd now like to call up our first panel, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, the gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Case, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, who will testify virtually. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for 5 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Well, thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith. I want to thank you for allowing me to testify before you and the members of the Budget Committee today. I'm honored to highlight some of the perspectives I, as well as my constituents, have to improve the operations of the United States Congress and the budget process. In order to craft a responsible budget plan that addresses the needs of the United States, Congress must make the difficult decisions, but essential decisions, about spending and challenging head-on the fiscal threats we face. Our repeated failure to control federal spending and address our mounting debt truly is the greatest long-term danger to this nation. Congress should fulfill their constitutional duty to produce a budget resolution that puts our nation on a fiscally sustainable path. Sound fiscal footing fosters an environment for a strong economy, opportunities for growth, and prosperity for all people. If we keep letting our debt spiral out of control, we put our country at risk of a financial crisis. The federal government has an outstanding public debt of more than $30 trillion. Every year since 1997, the Congress has failed to maintain a fiscally responsible budget and instead has relied on too much raising of our debt ceiling. Our current normal of not passing a balanced budget is irresponsible and poses a major national security threat. In fact, at the time, Admiral Mike Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was asked, what is the greatest threat to our national security? And he said, the national debt. Both parties have failed to restore regular order in the budget and appropriations process and become comfortable with passing irresponsible continuing resolutions and omnibus spending legislation. To address this issue, I've introduced multiple pieces of legislation. First, the No Budget, No Pay Act. The No Budget, No Pay Act would prohibit members of the House or Senate from receiving pay if their respective chamber does not pass a budget by April 15th of each year, which is a requirement. You cannot continue to budget on this step-by-step process and create the certainty necessary for the federal agencies and the American people. Next, Inaction Has Consequences Act. The Inaction Has Consequences Act mandates that if members of Congress do not complete appropriations bills by the end of the fiscal year, their pay is withheld. If members cannot get their most basic responsibility of funding our government done, we must be held accountable. Finally, the Stay on Schedule resolution. The Stay on Schedule resolution changes congressional procedures to prohibit the House from taking a recess in August unless it has passed all 12 appropriations bills individually by July 31st of 2022. This resolution, in conjunction with my other legislation, the No Budget, No Pay Act and Inaction Has Consequences Act, will put the proper accountability measures in place to ensure Congress gets its primary job done on time. It's time to finally pass measures like mine that will hold members to a higher standard and complete the work of the people. Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith, thank you for allowing me the time to testify before you today, and I look forward to working with you and the rest of the committee to restore America's fiscal footing.
Ms. Whitman, thank you for your comments. Is there any member who wishes to ask a question of Mr. Whitman? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Whitman. I just want to point out that's an interesting comment from the Admiral. And at the time he made that, we were at about 60% debt to GDP,
Yes.
I believe, if I remember correctly. And now we're at about 133% debt to GDP. And so I think you're exactly right in identifying this as a major threat potentially to the country going forward, and something that we should be addressing in Congress. And I think looking at that particular measure, debt to GDP, it's going going to be tough to balance the budget anytime in the future, but it took us a long time to get here. And we should be thinking about how we can change the trajectory. And instead of continuing to grow that debt to GDP, we could start to see that tail off. And if we do that, I think we do have a pathway out of this. If we don't, if we continue to spend trillions and we continue to add to the debt, particularly as a measure compared to GDP, I think it's a great way to look at it. We are in potentially serious trouble. We've had every time in history when a country has gone that path and not changed course, it hasn't ended well. And so really appreciate you bringing that to our attention. I think any kind of measures like that that can hold us accountable are very, very important. And I think it's really important what that budget looks like as well. We have to change the trajectory going forward. So thank you so much. Appreciate you speaking out on this.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. And especially with inflation today, it's going to exacerbate what we pay in interest on the national debt. The fiscal challenges of this nation are only going to get greater.
Yeah, I think every percentage in inflation, every percentage in interest, we're spending about $150 billion more in interest. And so that's a real problem going forward. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, gentlemen. Is there any other member who wishes to ask for time? I'll just make one comment. Just kind of for the record, back in 2017, we had a joint select committee on budgetary appropriations processes. Steve Womack, who was then the chairman of this committee, was the chair of that group, and many of the ideas that you mentioned were discussed at length, both in hearings that joint committee had and also in deliberations of the group. And unfortunately, we couldn't get any of those proposals even put before the House through that process. And I think the conclusion of the group was that while they all seemed to make some sense, that ultimately, if the will of the individual members of Congress is not there, that no procedures are going to change things. But those proposals are certainly worthy of further discussion. I thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Case.
Thank you so much, Chair Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some broader thoughts with you today, and I do deeply appreciate this committee's Member Day tradition. I need not dwell on the true state of our national budget by any measure. Annual deficits, total debt, debt to GDP, interest as a percentage of, and on, it is severe and worsening. The only measure cited as positive, year-over-year deficit improvement, is meaningless against a baseline of necessary but actual record COVID deficit spending. For those dwindling few who care about budgets and deficits and debts and other such annoying and obstructive concepts, these are hard times. We are told they don't matter, that we can have our cake and eat it too. Budgets are treated as pure balancing exercises, if that, as opposed to fiscal, monetary, economic, and social policy direction. Guardrail rules like PAYGO against our worst inclinations towards rationalization, short-term gratification, and avoidance are ignored. Budget rules like reconciliation are co-opted. The honest reporters like the Congressional Budget Office are demonized. We are stuck in an endless debate and gyration between feed the beast and starve the beast, united only by a common purpose of driving the budget into a deeper hole. How do we return to a fiscally and, yes, thus economically and socially sustainable path? Do we dare to start by attempting to agree on some common principles, as in stabilizing annual deficits and the national debt will fight inflation, will promote economic growth, work, and investment, will slow the growth of federal interest costs, and will secure our major trust funds for future generations? Can we also agree that the inverse is equally true and destructive? Can we then pursue some difficult but constructive advances towards some restored discipline and stability? Here are just a few. Number one, the Sustainable Budget Act. This proposal, introduced by me and others this Congress on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, would establish a National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform to identify policies to achieve fiscal sustainability over the long term. This commission would have access to expedited legislative procedures to pass recommendations to balance the budget and meaningfully improve the long-term fiscal outlook. Yes, of course, similar approaches in the past have not ultimately succeeded, but it was not for lack of constructive effort and, measured against the alternative of the current status quo, which is virtually nothing, it is at least demonstrated effort and progress. Number two, the Trust Act. This proposal, also bipartisan and bicameral by me and others, would take steps to secure the endangered species of Social Security and Medicare by similar means. To critics, same comments as a Sustainable Budget Act. Number three, transparent budget information and analysis. It seems so obvious that accurate information about the true impacts of legislation on the fiscal health of the nation is essential. Yet from the sounds of it, that's a mortal threat. This year, for example, over puzzling obstacles, the House passed the Fiscal State of the Nation resolution, a good first step. However, in many ways, we are still legislatively blind to the full impacts of our own decisions by our own hand. We too often proceed with floor votes without CBO scoring. Furthermore, CBO scoring does not include the cost of servicing the debt, which means every time legislation increases the debt, we are not accounting for the full cost of that legislation on the federal budget. We must change that. And finally, the Conrad rule. We must re-examine how Congress approaches budget reconciliation, a process that was and is focused on budget discipline and decision, not as a general filibuster circumvention tool. We should adopt legislation that I've introduced to reinstate the Conrad rule, which would require all reconciliation bills to be budget neutral to go with renewed scrutiny on any appropriate reconciliation. These are just a few baby steps down a long and difficult road back to some form of fiscal sustainability. I hope we can take them step by step before it's too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Case. Is there any member who would like to speak or ask a question of Mr. Case? If not, thank you for your testimony. And now I yield 5 minutes. I yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I, too, want to thank the Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and committee members for having me here today to share my priorities for the FY23 budget. I am proud to represent the 29th Congressional District in Texas, which includes parts of Houston, South Houston, Pasadena, yes, there's a Pasadena in Texas, Jacinto City, and Galena Park. My district is 77% Latino, and therefore adequate government funding is critical to support our communities in my district and to help my constituents. I thank President Biden and your leadership, Chairman Yarmouth, in delivering a responsible, caring budget that intends to serve all Americans and robustly funds critical anti-poverty programs. I want to discuss a portion of the President's budget under the Department of Transportation, which I am particularly pleased with, and I urge your consideration of the Consolidated Railroad Infrastructure and Crisis Improvement Grants Program. Trains are a problem in my district. This program supports a wide range of freight and intercity passenger rail projects that furthers the Department of Transportation's safety, economic equity, and climate goals. Specifically, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grants are intended to improve the safety, efficiency, and reliability of passenger and freight rail systems. These grants can also provide the values of Justice for the Initiative, and as such, the FY 2023 President's budget proposes to dedicate at least $200 million to this grant program to mitigate the detrimental safety and quality of life effects rail transportation can have on underserved and disadvantaged communities like mine. Mr. Chairman, trains sometimes block traffic for more than 30 minutes, sometimes even as high as an hour, blocking children from getting to school, EMS services and ambulance services getting to their patients, and other critical needs. I am here today to request members of the Budget Committee to do what it can to maintain the strong funding levels championed by the President for this critical program. Further, I want to flag a bill which I have championed since the last Congress, which encourages a $200 million investment in institutions of higher education which provide high-quality training for maritime education. My bill was H.R. 987. Educating the next generation of maritime workers is a huge priority of mine. And this is a bipartisan effort, which I hope to see reflected as we work on the budget this year. But broadly speaking, Mr. Chairman, we need to focus to helping Americans recover from the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic through workforce training, investments in research, and development of in and up and coming in industries and STEM. I would also encourage us to look at budget priorities to advance the President's Build Back Better agenda as much as we can, and also any priorities that would help the uninsured. Recently, after we got the latest community survey numbers, my district was named the district in the country with the highest number of uninsured people. That's the #1 list I do not want to be on. Anything that we can do to better fund, robustly fund programs to help the uninsured would be really great for my district. And the other programs like expanding the child tax credit, free child care in preschool, and clean energy tax credit would also be a boost. Let's build upon the great work President Biden has done, what appropriators have achieved, and Chairman Yarmouth, like people like you, have worked on for many years. So thank you again for your consideration, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone who has a question for Ms. Garcia? Yes, Mr. Grothman.
We'll kind of give it to all three of you. First of all, I was a little bit amazed by that testimony. I mean, our big problem in this country right now is inflation, which is entirely caused by past excessive spending. And you just gave us a long list of programs that you could argue really aren't even constitutional programs. And I think, at least in Wisconsin, and I'm under the impression in other states, the states are running surpluses, big surpluses. So why we, under any circumstances, would allow people back home to believe it's up to ask the federal government for more things when the state are running surpluses, I don't know. But I'm gonna give the same question to all three of you, just a quick yes or no. And by the way, there's a shot at Republicans just like Democrats, because when we were in charge and had all three, we did an abysmal job. Would each one of the three of you, would you be supportive of a budget out of this committee that's zero across the board, just boom, zero across the board? Because I know there's waste everywhere, and just, we'll rattle down the three of you. Should we ask them that? That's what I'm gonna try to talk to Mr. Yarmouth about.
It's your time. You can ask if you want to. You've already asked it, so they could respond.
Mr. Grothman, I'm in full support of zero-based budgeting.
I mean, zero budget on all.
No, he's saying zero budget, not zero base budget.
Just out of this committee, zero increase, same as last year.
Oh, zero increase. Yeah, okay. Zero increase. I'm all for whatever we can do on fiscal control, zero increase, whatever we can do to be able to manage our spending. Yes.
I mean, sir, I'm for PAYGO, bottom line. I think there are areas that we do need to increase spending, but they should be budget neutral. We should be able to we can have a debate over that. But my point to you in the testimony is at least do that on a budget responsible basis. And so that's gonna lead you to reductions or increase in taxes, reductions or increases in spending, as long as you do it on a budget sustainable basis over time. We can then engage in a broader policy debate about what we're actually talking about right now. But unless we get to that baseline of responsible fiscal principles, the bottom line is we're gonna drive the bigger picture budget into a hole, and that's gonna have consequences.
I would not support just zero. I think it's, frankly, I've never heard such a recommendation before. I was formerly the city controller in Houston and oversaw the budget and investments for a very large city, multi-billion-dollar budget and investment portfolio. I think if anyone would have presented that to me back then, I would have frankly just laughed because there are just so many things that happen that are out of control. Insurance increases, costs of employees, budget things that are out of our control that just happen with time that you couldn't run a government if you just did zero. So I would say no.
Mr. Chairman, too, if I can add, the one place where there would need to be some sort of statutory exception would be for national security in case of a national emergency. I think you have to have that provision there.
But his proposal will not allow any increase if it's zero.
I don't think maybe if something happens in the future, not now. We're not in an emergency yet.
Okay. Anyone else? Well, oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, thanks for coming. I'm gonna piggyback a little bit off of Mr. Grothman. I know Mr. Grothman's essential proposal is a 0% increase in the budget baseline, and then having us basically have a flat budget outlook moving forward. So we're not dealing with CBO essentially coming back to us with an inflation kicker that, frankly, nobody examines except for maybe a handful of staff and maybe the chair and ranking member of the budget committee and the relevant appropriating committees. I'm gonna attack a different way. In the budget apparatus, there are 20 budget functions that basically create the 12 budgetary categories that we appropriate off of. These budget functions range from income security down to, I forget the smallest one. What do you guys believe, or what do you think about essentially taking the largest budget function, the smallest budget function, there are 20, and then Congress basically, for lack of a better phrase, zeroing out those budget functions, and then in each calendar year, you rebuild those two budget functions from the ground up. That way, let's take income security. That way, if you zero it out, the relevant agencies that spend money in those budget functions would have to come to Congress and actually advocate for the money. Then Congress would have the responsibility of rebuilding the budget function from the ground up. It's not saying there will be no money spent in income security. What it is saying is that in this calendar year, we zero out income security, the relevant agencies come and actually have to ask for the money. And then Congress has the responsibility of rebuilding it so we can actually get at waste, get at ineffective programs that are outdated, probably get rid of programs that we just fund where there's no legislative authority anymore to fund them. My question to the panel is, what is your viewpoint on a proposal like that? Which is a hybrid of Mr. Grothman's.
Mr. Donald, what you described is exactly what zero-based budgeting is. Everybody starts at zero, and then you build a budget each year based upon what the priorities are, and then you have to come in and substantiate what your request is. So I'm 100% in favor of zero-based budgeting.
Yeah, I think it is different from what Mr. Rothman has described. You're just talking about basic zero-based budgeting, which I think is a concept that is wise and appropriate. I sit on the Appropriations Committee. We do try to go back and ask the basic questions every year, starting back to the beginning. Is this function a good function? Is it spending wisely? Should it be increased? Should it be reduced? That is also, by the way, of course, the responsibility of all of the authorizing committees and the House Committee on Oversight. So we all have a responsibility in taking ourselves back to the beginning every fiscal year. That's how our system is set up. The question is whether we're doing it wisely or not, but I agree with you. In principle, we need to be asking these questions every year.
I think the current budget system lends itself to doing that. I think each member can start at zero and then move in whatever direction they want to when they come here, when they go through the whole process. And I think the bigger challenge, because our budget is so large and is so diverse in terms of those categories that you're talking about, the bigger challenge would be is to decide which is the most important function and where are you going to start with zeroing out which function. And that's going to would be a bigger battle. That I think it's an interesting thought and certainly merits some discussion.
Well, actually, I got a proposal for you. Glad you mentioned that. So the proposal basically is,
I've been looking for a proposal all my life.
well, here we go. So I got
I
one.
wasn't talking about that kind of proposal.
But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, so what you essentially have is we have the 20 budget functions that do exist. Let's say we wanted to start next year, okay? So next year, Congress would essentially take the largest, or the House, forget the Senate. The Senate can do their own thing. The
They
House,
always do. They always do.
I know, right? The House could essentially take the largest and smallest budget function next
But
year
you're saying largest and smallest by budget
by
number?
the amount that's spent. So
Okay.
every budget function has their own dollar amount. Income security is the largest. It's about 1.7, 1.8 trillion. We zero out the largest, we zero out the smallest. Leave the other 18. Congress just focuses, the House just focuses on those two. Then, in the subsequent year, we then take the second largest and the second smallest, focus on those. In the third year, so on and so forth. So that what the House is really doing is that over a 10-year period, you've truly examined the budget because, to your point, it's so voluminous. Where is the time and the manpower to actually zero out the entire budget in one calendar year? I would
So
argue
what happens
it
to
doesn't
the
exist.
other functions while you're
They would stay in
examining
place,
only two?
as they would stay in place and would follow the baseline that CBO will produce, but it will put Congress on the path to actually clearing out certain sectors of the budget in a systematic approach. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm 20 seconds over. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Donald. And now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter.
Oh, I forgot she was there. Oops.
There she is.
Hello, I apologize, but due to this panel running late, I am now boarding a flight following the shooting in my district. So if I can go on the next panel, I will try to do that. But I have to board my flight after having to fly back because of the shooting. So I unfortunately cannot give this testimony from an airplane jet bridge. So, but I enjoyed hearing all of the thoughtful ideas about budget processing. So I will try to log back on once I take my seat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Porter. And obviously, you can submit your ideas and comments for the record if you can't work that out. We appreciate your trying. With that, we will now seat the second panel. We have Mr. Fred Keller, Mr. Blake Moore, Mr. Michael Cloud, and that's the panel. Okay. Thank you for that quick transition. Our second panel today includes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Moore, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Cloud. We welcome all of you. As we mentioned in the first hearing, your testimony will be included in full in the record. You have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. And I now recognize Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm from Texas, so. Not a big deal, but certainly want the folks at home to know.
Yeah, please, the gentleman from Texas, Mr.
Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Yermuth, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. Thank you for having us here today. This committee is tasked with the important constitutional obligation placed on Congress in Article 1, Section 8 to determine how the federal government should spend the revenue collected from taxpayers. The budget process is vital because it is within the budget framework that we evaluate the proposed legislation to ensure we are spending within agreed upon spending limits. You mentioned, Mr. Chairman, that this member day is a longstanding tradition. My testimony today is becoming one. I was here last year and the year before. I came to talk to you about a bill I introduced, H.R. 638, the Cost Estimates Improvement Act. I've reintroduced the bill again and asked you to consider it and make it a permanent part of the congressional budgeting. The bill would require the CBO and JCT to include debt servicing costs in their estimates. I've sent letters to this committee in the past asking it direct CBO and JCT to include debt servicing cost in their estimates. It's my understanding that this committee has the authority to achieve this. We actually don't need the legislation. You could order it. Otherwise, I hope to see the committee to hold a markup on my bill and others that would help hold Congress accountable for how we spend taxpayer dollars. While this issue is not new, it's now become even more pressing, given our historically high levels of inflation burdening the American families across the country. According to a new report from Penn Wharton Budget Model, inflation is now costing the typical family $3,500 a year. Meanwhile, the Fed has begun raising interest rates, which means the amount we pay as a nation for the interest on the debt will begin to rise even more rapidly. Mr. Chairman, we do not have the luxury of ignoring the true cost of our spending decisions. Our nation's outstanding debt is $30 trillion. For reference, when I testified a little over a year ago, the nation's debt stood at $28 trillion. The year before, it was at $23.4 trillion. These numbers are so big, it's hard for the average person to comprehend, but they represent a real threat to our nation's financial future. And we are increasing the deficits and debts at these alarming rates without a full and complete picture of the legislation we are voting on in Congress because we regularly do not consider the interest cost. As the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget pointed out just a couple of weeks ago, the federal government spends $330 billion a year, or $2,207 per taxpayer, on interest payments. That's more than on food stamps and disability insurance combined. 2/3 of our debt is slated to roll over in the next 5 years, likely into higher interest rate bonds. The folks back home understand this phenomenon. If they were to budget for their monthly car payment and not count the cost of interest in their payment, they would find that they were short month by month on what they expected to pay. In essence, Congress does this same thing by not considering the comprehensive budgetary impact of spending and taxing proposals. This distorts congressional decision-making in favor of more spending and debt accumulation than what otherwise might be the case. Simply put, including debt servicing costs and legislative cost estimates will better equip lawmakers to make informed spending decisions. My legislation does one more important thing that would help lawmakers make better spending decisions. It requires the cost estimates to include a list of duplicative programs with the covered legislation. If cost estimates were required to point out such duplication, it might give members pause before voting to spend more taxpayer dollars that create new duplicative programs or expand existing programs that duplicate others. But the good news is that while legislation required consideration of the interest cost is preferred, we do not need to wait for the legislation to pass, as I've mentioned. Last month, I sent the chairman and ranking member of this body, as well as your counterparts in the U.S. Senate, a letter signed by myself, Senator Mike Lee, and 40 of our colleagues. In the letter, we ask that you direct the CBO to begin including debt servicing costs in all legislative cost estimates produced. Mr. Chairman, reining in our debt and deficits only gets harder the longer we wait. That is in part because our interest rates have been historically low, but that is already changing. In order to address our inflation crisis, the Federal Reserve has already begun raising the interest rate and has signaled it will implement a total of 7 increases by the end of this year. Higher interest rates means we can no longer afford to ignore the cost of interest on our debt. Again, as the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget pointed out just a couple weeks ago, for every 1 percentage point increase in interest rates, deficits grow by $2 trillion over a decade. That's on top of the nearly $13 trillion in projected borrowing over the next day. This isn't a red or blue issue, Republican or Democrat. This is simply good governance, and I hope you'll consider this. Thank you again, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. I'm going to use the discretion of the chair to now recognize Ms. Porter, who is ready to testify, and we'll hold any questions for Mr. Cloud until after her testimony. The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Very much, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate that. Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Smith, and members of the Budget Committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. As you prepare the budget resolution for fiscal year 2023, I urge you to consider increasing the budget authority for federal law enforcement programs included in Budget Function 750. This budget category includes important agencies such as the Department of Justice, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. These agencies are responsible for confronting enormous challenges for our country, and they need more resources to better serve Americans. Just last week, the CDC reported that more than 107,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2021, the highest annual toll on record. Since the 1970s, the number of drug overdose deaths has increased every year except one. This devastating drug epidemic is happening at the same time as the nation grapples with an epidemic of gun violence. Year was the worst year for a shooting in a church in my district on Sunday. More than 45,000 Americans died in gun-related incidents in 2020, an all-time high, with no sign of a decline in gun deaths over the past year. The record number of Americans dying from drugs and guns demands a crisis from our law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement must also respond to the humanitarian crisis on our southern border. In March, Customs and Border Protection encountered the 3rd highest number of migrants entering the United States in a single month ever. Over the past decade, tens of thousands of unaccompanied children and families have arrived at our border seeking asylum. I have advocated for Congress to pass legislation as soon as possible to provide supplemental funding for law enforcement and humanitarian organizations at the border. This funding would improve our capacity to respond to the immediate crisis, but Congress needs to act now to address border and immigration needs for future years. Congress must also act to address inflation, another crisis that demands a law enforcement response. For decades, antitrust enforcement has declined while corporations have grown bigger and stronger. Corporations now have market power to raise prices for consumers far beyond what is necessary to cover their costs. This is great for big business, but a disaster for ordinary Americans. Corporate profits hit a record high last year, growing 25% in just 1 year, while wages for workers increased only 4.5%. President Biden's proposed budget would decrease the deficit, which will help slow down inflation. But cutting spending for law enforcement would be the wrong approach if we want lower prices for consumers. Instead, we need to increase the size of the antitrust division at the Department of Justice so it can crack down on massive corporations that are exploiting their market power to gouge Americans. These four crises demand the attention of our federal government. They will not be solved without a sustained federal response over the next decade. Congress needs to provide our law enforcement agencies with adequate budgets to make real progress on addressing these long-term challenges. As you consider fiscal priorities for 2023, I urge you to consider increasing legislative budgets related to oversight. As a member dedicated to oversight work, my experiences have shown me firsthand that our oversight committees are not sufficiently funded to actively monitor our federal programs and agencies. Too often we are sending money out the door without the safeguards in place to make sure that every dollar is spent wisely. The American people expect better stewardship of their taxpayer dollars, and they deserve more in the effort to prevent fraud and reduce waste. It is not enough to provide funding for inspector generals to conduct investigations and write reports. Congress has a constitutional duty to conduct its own oversight, and we must fulfill that duty to the American people. The buck stops with us. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today and especially accommodating my travel situation. Thank you again. I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. We're in a very strange and uncomfortable position. We are obligated, we're required by House rules to adjourn for the joint session, which begins at 11. We have two witnesses left. If the two witnesses think they can get their testimony done in that period of time, we'll proceed, and then we can have, if there's time for questions, fine. If not, we can have people submit questions or comments for the record. Is that agreeable? All right, I recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Moore.
Excellent. I'll make my comments brief. I won't regurgitate a lot of the things we know we're at 30 trillion in debt. I appreciate the opportunity, Chairman and Ranking Member, to be here because this matters to every single office, whether you're on Budget Committee, whether you're on Ways and Means or not. This matters to every single congressional office. This matters to every single American. And I wanted to use this as an opportunity to share and highlight something that I've done in my district. I have a group of about 10 to 12 people that experts in their own fields, whether they're in manufacturing or they're an economist. They've engaged with me, whether they were a former general in the Air Force, they've engaged with me on a debt and deficit task force. This is not just a task force where we wanted to meet once and have a round table. We met quarterly, and we put together an 8-page document with a framework that actually talks about what are some of the things that we can do. And I'm actually really excited, as I've been listening to previous testimony, that some of those ideas have already been incorporated. And I just wanted to communicate through this Member Day my commitment from Utah 1 for Utahns to be one of the most financially, fiscally responsible states in the nation that carries a balanced budget and a rainy day fund every single year to help share some of the ideas and ways that we can get this under control. This was, I remember when I first ran for office, the commentary that I would share was, it's been 20 years, but we were able to do it. Congress was able to find a way to work together and get this to a balanced budget. We've sustained a strong economic growth period up until 2020, and we need to take that as an opportunity to go after this. I have 4 basic elements, 4 pillars for this framework: grow the economy, save and strengthen vital programs, focus America's spending, and fix Congress's budget process. And I think for this committee, the two that are most relevant, given your area of jurisdiction, is focus America's spending. That largely deals with discretionary, and fixing the Congress's budget process. GDP, Americans will look to gross debt often as an indicator of economic health. Debt to GDP ratio is particularly useful in measuring our fiscal well-being. Our GDP has not grown to keep pace with our growing debt. And we're at a conservative estimate of 1.25, but it's well over, it could even be well over 1.3 back to World War II levels on what our debt to GDP ratio is, and this is dangerous. And one of the items in here is to get that so we can have this to the debt to GDP markers instead of a debt ceiling. The debt ceiling has become almost an arbitrary thing every few years where we just constantly raise it, and it's not really tied to how we can go about achieving success and achieving results. And so areas on that are important that we can have really good progress that we need to make here. The American people need to see that we are adults in the room and we're making progress towards this crippling national security risk, and that is what our debt is. There's several other ideas. I'll just highlight this today, and I'll hope to share it with every member on the committee, Republican and Democrat, so we can start to be serious about how we're going to go about taking some of this back. And I'll yield back my time. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and as I've said, your entire statement will be included in the record in full. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member, Smith, for having this hearing and listening to what the members have to say. I just want to highlight what we all know, that every American who earns a paycheck understands that raising a family and they're running their business, they know that they make decisions, and they know that their expenses cannot exceed their income. You can't do that. That's not sustainable. But, with inflation hitting recently it hit a 40-year high, and Americans are paying historically high prices for things like gas, food, if they travel, air travel. We in Congress need to make government more efficient and get spending under control, just like families and businesses do with their own budgets. And I heard some of the testimony here about how you can and can't do things, but I tell you what, businesses do it all the time. I heard it was said in the previous panel that we don't understand things increase that are out of our control. Well, I tell you what, we have a lot more impact on that than the families and the businesses that rely on us to make good decisions. And one thing that has impact is seeing the president's budget. His plan for fiscal 2023, it's clear that he doesn't understand how to budget responsibly. And it's likely because he's been in Washington, D.C. since 1973. President Biden's budget will spend $73 trillion over the next 10 years and grow our debt to $45 trillion by 2032. That's not responsible. We can't do that. In 2019, the Congressional Budget Office said if we did nothing differently, by the year 2025, we would spend more on debt service than we do defense. We need to abandon this reckless proposal. It should raise a red flag for everyone in Washington, Democrats, Republicans, anybody that wants to facilitate this kind of reckless spending. Americans have already seen the cost of President Biden's tax and spend policies at the pump, at the grocery store, and on the farm, as well as Main Street America. In response to the president's budget proposal, to date, Democrats in the House have yet to release a budget resolution for fiscal year 2023. The national debt is nearly $30.5 trillion, and we're 7 months into 2022. The Democrats haven't produced a solution, and it's poor planning, and quite frankly, it's irresponsible. Meanwhile, we are, when it comes to providing oversight for federal programs authorized by the American Rescue Plan, how much fraud and waste have we seen come from this law, and how effective have those dollars been at providing the stated purpose of COVID-19 pandemic relief. It's estimated that only 9% of the ARPA funds went directly to combating COVID-19. This raises serious questions on how we hold accountable and how we do our budgeting. Many states, as was mentioned earlier, many states are holding on to recovery funds. Some of them are showing surpluses. It's more important than ever that these funds are being spent responsibly and are actually tied to the pandemic. And an example of what we can see is that, there's still roughly $1 trillion of unspent funds that are still remaining. It might be time to consider reevaluating what should be considered pandemic relief in some of these areas. It's caused a fiscal mess and record high inflation. The example I want to mention is there's $2 billion have been diverted from COVID-19 vaccines and tests to house illegal immigrants due to President Biden's border crisis. Additionally, our team recently discovered that sponsors who house unaccompanied alien children, or UACs, are not required to lawfully be present in the country themselves. On top of that, according to the Department of Justice, only about half of the unaccompanied alien children actually show up for their required court hearings. We're spending money on these things, and it's creating a crisis. This should be concerning on many fronts, and it begs the question, how much taxpayer money is going to fund different things other than what it was intended to, like the crisis we're seeing with the unaccompanied minor children. One way to better provide accountability over these programs is for this committee to produce a budget resolution that puts us on a path to fiscal sanity. It's time to stop leaving the financial disaster for the next generation and put together a budget that meets the needs of the American people, not of the President Biden or Speaker Pelosi. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and as I mentioned before, we are required by House rules to adjourn at this point. And so any questions from members or comments can be submitted for the record, and we appreciate the members coming and spending their time and testifying for us. With that, if there's no further business, this hearing is adjourned.